The world has seen many destructive wars, the Mongol invasions, the Taiping Rebellion, and World War II. But no war has ever seen the widespread use of nuclear weapons. Only World War II, which was ended by the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has even seen nuclear weapons used. But despite this, the world has come close to a nuclear war several times in the past 100 years, with the rivalry between communism and capitalism. The superpowers behind these ideologies faced off against each other for 40 years, always having the capability to begin the most destructive war imaginable. But through cooler heads, war was always prevented, despite the mass amount of tension points which could have started World War III. But what if this changed? What if, instead of the Berlin blockade being resolved via plane, those planes were shot down? What if, during the first diplomatic incident between the two world superpowers, war broke out? What if the Berlin blockade caused World War III? Following the end of World War II, Germany was divided into separate zones of occupation, divided between France, Britain, the US, and the USSR. During mid-1948, though, the Western nations began to move towards a unified Western German state by the implementation of a common currency throughout their zones of occupation, the Deutschmark. This move towards a unified Germany angered the Soviets, who in response established a blockade of West Berlin, preventing any Allied supplies from reaching the city, over 150 kilometers from Western occupied Germany. In our timeline, the West responded by sending planes filled with supplies into the city, preventing locals from starving, while also defying the Soviets and preventing an all-out conflict. In reality, though the situation seemed tense, neither side wanted an all-out war of the issue. The Americans didn't have enough troops deployed in the West to prevent a Soviet invasion into Western Europe, and the Soviets didn't yet have a nuclear arsenal to compete with the US, meaning the Soviets were prone to US nuclear bomb raids. The two global superpowers would not want to rush into a war, but they could, and certainly came close to several points in the Cold War, accidentally fall into war. If during the Berlin blockade the planes were shot down by Soviet anti-air, the people of West Germany and the troops within it would slowly starve. Eventually, these people would try to pass into the east to get food, and when Soviet forces find West Berliners and Western troops trying to cross into the east, shots would be fired. The two groups of forces would trade gunfire, but eventually the Western forces are soundly defeated, and Soviet troops march in and occupy West Berlin. In July 1948, Britain, France, and America would declare war against the Soviets for their aggressive annexation of land. And soon the war would expand across Europe, officially beginning World War III. Initially, Soviet forces would have a massive advantage, as they were already in position, whereas a bulk of American forces would have to be sent across the Atlantic. The Soviets blitzed through the Western forces into Germany, managing to take Munich and Hamburg. They also began a large campaign in the south of the continent to secure the safety of their border there, pushing down and taking the north of Greece for the communist faction in the Greek Civil War. They also make massive pushes from both the east and the west into Turkey, aiming to knock them out entirely. In the first few months, Stalin would also resend forces to Iran to secure control over the oil of the nation, and to prevent the West from using it as a staging ground for an invasion. Stalin would then begin to encourage communists across the West to revolt against their capitalist governments. Italian communists, who were currently being prosecuted by the Italian government and being inspired by Soviet successes across the front line, would rise up and declare the creation of the People's Republic of Italy. In France as well, the communist revolts would break out across the nation, fueled by the poor conditions caused by the post-World War II era. These revolutions by themselves would ordinarily be relatively weak, though with arms and espionage support from the Soviets, as well as Western forces being all the way at the front lines, these revolutions would be able to quickly consolidate control over large territories, in turn pulling away troops from the front lines. The diversion of troops would weaken the front lines further, and the Soviets would take advantage with another massive push operation, dividing the Western Front into two and managing to seize most important cities up to the Rhine. In Asia, the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, would take advantage of the chaos in Europe to quickly invade the South, assuming that the US would just allow the annexation due to the situation in Europe. He would be quickly proven incorrect as the US officially declares war on North Korea. But though the American forces in the South would put up a strong resistance, the North Korean forces, supported by the Soviets and the CCP, would quickly seize the entire peninsula. For now, the Chinese Civil War would remain a separate conflict from World War III, though fears would begin to arise in the US of Asia becoming an impenetrable fortress if the communists were to take control of China. Back in the West, the Soviets would quickly rout Greek forces, officially establishing the provincial democratic government in charge of Greece, while the Kingdom of Greece flees to the Aegean Islands. The Soviet advance into Turkey would also progress further, with Soviet forces pushing to the edge of Istanbul by late 1948. By 1949, the Soviets would have all but fully taken Germany, and begun a march into nations such as Denmark, the Benelux, France, and even connecting to the Italian revolutionaries. While in Turkey, they would have fully seized Istanbul and would begin marching towards Ankara in hopes of soon capitulating Turkey to focus fully on the Western Front. In Asia, the Indo-Chinese Revolution would have taken advantage of the situation within France to fully kick out France from the territory, forming a new government under Tuong Chin. By March 1949, the Soviets would reach the maximum of their European control, seizing all of Germany, the Benelux, and controlling a large majority of France, including Paris, controlling all except the south of Italy and approaching Ankara. But notice that I said this would be their maximum extent. By this point, American troops are once again flooding into the Western Front, halting Soviet advances. In addition, the Western Air Force is now beginning to significantly outclass the Soviets, leading to massive Soviet losses in air battles. Due to this, Soviet forces now no longer have air superiority, and bombing campaigns of supply hubs are reaching deeper and deeper behind enemy lines. By June, the Soviets would have experienced their first major losses on land, forcing them to retreat back. From this point on, the Soviets would be on the back foot, and despite the capture of Ankara by Soviet forces, the war was clearly changing tides. By this point, a pact between the Soviets, Chinese, Koreans, and Indo-Chinese would have likely been established to deepen ties between the four major communist Asian groups. This pact would be the last straw for the US, officially joining the Chinese Civil War and World War III together. Though by this point, American forces would not be able to prevent the collapse of the KMT control over most of China, as the CCP divides their forces into two and begins a push to the coast. By 1950, the West would be able to reclaim most of France and liberate Amsterdam and Rome via naval invasions. The Allies would also begin a naval invasion into Albania via Sicily, hoping to create more distraction for Soviet forces and to assist in the reclaiming of Greece. Even in Turkey, the Soviets would begin to fall back, as despite the loss of Ankara, the Turkish government would remain at war with the Soviets, assisted by an Allied invasion of Gallipoli to prevent Soviet naval meddling in the Aegean Sea and beyond. Though, things would not be so great in Asia, where nearly the entirety of continental Asia would be seized by communist forces. Sorry to interrupt the video, but since I hit 1K subscribers, I'm contractually obligated to do that YouTuber thing now. Did you know that over 80% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, PS, I have a Discord now. The link to it should be in the description of this video, so if you want to check that out, it'd be greatly appreciated. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. You may be wondering why I haven't talked about nukes yet, since I so clearly ominously mentioned them in the intro. Well, the Americans up to this point wouldn't have been able to nuke Russian western cities. Why? Because by this point, the West hasn't developed missiles and rockets to send nuclear bombs, and so every nuke has to be sent via plane. If the US tries to send a group of planes to the USSR, they would have to travel over 1,000 kilometers of hostile territory to get to the closest Russian cities, and along the way they would be incredibly susceptible to attacks from anti-air. From the US's point of view, it's not yet worth it to send nukes when they have such a low chance of actually getting to their targets. But the Soviets, who by 1950 would have developed their first atomic bombs, would be close enough to western cities. And so, in early 1950, Paris would be hit with an atomic bomb around the same size as Little Boy, killing hundreds of thousands of people in a single blast. This would shock the West, who would not have expected the Soviets to develop nuclear weaponry so soon. In response, the US would immediately begin to use nuclear bombs against the Soviets in any situation, mostly using them for strikes on strategic locations in the Western Front. But in the East, the US would begin the nuclear bombings of cities such as Pyongyang, Dalian, and Vladivostok. The atomic bombing of Paris would trigger a huge scare across the West, and major focus would go to improving and developing more airplanes and anti-air to prevent any future nuclear strikes. As a result of this, the difference between the Soviet and Western air forces grows exponentially larger, as the West gains near dominance of the skies, allowing for massive pushes into Central Europe, reclaiming much of Germany, Italy, and Greece, as Soviet forces are forced to consolidate around their satellite states. By 1951, the tide has truly turned, and the Soviets are beginning to be pushed back even out of their satellite states in the West. The governments of these states would soon collapse due to their political upheaval within, and so the Soviets would be forced to take direct military control over these states, further draining resources and weakening Soviet control. In the Caucasus, the West begins its first pushes into Soviet territory, reclaiming Iran through a naval invasion from the south and beginning to seize the Baku oil fields. Even in Asia, the war is beginning to shift, as the West begins several massive naval invasions into Busan, Saigon, and Fuzhou. It would be now that America is finally close enough to the Soviets to launch their plan, the atomic bombing of most of the largest Soviet cities, killing over 3 million civilians through their atomic bombings alone over the course of 1951. This causes absolute administrative chaos within the Soviet government and armed forces, causing mass surrenders all across the front line. This show of force by the Americans leads to more states joining in the war against the Soviets, and the weakness displayed by the central government would inspire independence movements to break out across the USSR, aiding in their total collapse. By September, the USSR would be hanging on by a thread, as they would be pushed in by all sides. Stalin, or whatever dictator is in control of the USSR, would stubbornly refuse to surrender, until the US utilizes its first hydrogen bomb on Moscow, killing 2.5 million people in the blast, and forcing whatever government is left into an unconditional surrender. By this point, Asia would still be under firm communist control, and the war to dislodge communist forces would likely still take another year, but eventually the Third World War would be over, with over 100 million dead in 5 years. Now the Allies have a tough job of redrawing almost the entirety of the old world. Starting in Germany, the British, French, and American zones of influence would be merged into a single German state, with its capital at Bonn, though the Saarland would be kept as a protectorate under the French. The Allies, however, would still feel uncomfortable with the idea of a completely unified Germany, and so would temporarily establish an East German state, hoping to counterbalance the two so neither could be too powerful. In addition, in the south, due to no agreement being made over Austria, Austria is now united and not bound to neutrality as in our timeline, instead being firmly within the Western sphere. In the former Soviet satellite states, the communist governments would be replaced with Western-style democracies almost 40 years before they historically did in our timeline, meaning these nations would be far more economically and politically stable, without Soviet extractions and meddling. Yugoslavia would be particularly interesting, as I could see the West putting into place a democratic and federal republic in the nation, with significant individual autonomy for each state, which, if successful, could prevent the collapse of Yugoslavia that we saw in our timeline, which would rapidly increase the economic development of this area compared to our timeline, potentially making Yugoslavia in the same weight category as Italy. In the east, several states would gain territory from the Soviets, including the annexation of Bessarabia by Romania, East Prussia by Poland, Karelia by Finland, and Azerbaijan by Iran. Following these annexations, the Allies would release all of the Soviet SSRs, and could even release some Muslim states in the Caucasus like Dagestan. All while the Russian Soviet government is overthrown and replaced with a Western sympathizer. Over in Asia, the Kuomintang will finally retake control over all of China back from the CCP. Korea will be unified under the South, and Indochina will be returned to France. Over the following years, I see it likely that the KMT will move to annex Tibet and Mongolia, similar to how the CCP took Tibet in our timeline. Though now, the KMT would have the ability to take Mongolia due to Russia's weakness after the war. Now, I'm currently displaying China as unified under the control of the KMT, but even after all of these wars, the KMT would not be in direct control over the large swathes of territory, with local leaders holding significant sway. It would likely be like this for a while, especially under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, who would try to use violence to put down these autonomous provinces, but to no avail. Under the dictatorial rule of Chiang, not much economic development would likely take place, as most of his reign would be spent quelling uprisings and having the nation not fall apart. After his death in the 70s, however, China would likely undergo a shift towards democracy, heavily modeled off the American federal system, with large provincial autonomy. Following the transition to democracy, the Chinese economy would finally begin growing at a significant rate, though nowhere near the levels seen under the CCP. Though this China would be far more agrarian than in our timeline, I would predict that around the 1990s, China would see a minor economic miracle, and by an alternate 2024, it would be clear that China's economy would have the capability to overtake that of the US. Down south, Indochina is likely liberated from France far later than in our timeline, and when it is, it's likely liberated under a nationalist group, which may lead to Indochina upon its independence staying unified. Overall, most European colonies would be held onto longer, especially in Africa, due to less anti-colonialist pressure. With only the US giving pressure to the Western empires to decolonize, more colonizers may fight to keep a hold of their colonies, which will significantly weaken almost every single one of these nations, with many in an alternate 2024 having been independent for only around 50 years. In Europe, due to the war, it's likely that something similar to the European coal and steel community was established to facilitate the sharing of resources among the Western allies, something which would be expanded to other economic resources in the post-war era to help all of the European economies recover from the years of war. Coupling that with a second wave of Marshall Plan aid, and the European economies would begin to restabilize relatively quickly. This also means that the compact that led to the creation of the European Union, or a compact very similar to it, already has significantly more interconnected elements between nations, and is far larger. It would start with most of Western Europe, but throughout the 60s and 70s, many more Eastern European nations would join in, including East Germany, Poland, and Yugoslavia. Maybe, by an alternate 2024, the European Union could even include nations such as Ukraine and Belarus. The greater size and power of this European Union so early on would mean that overall Europe is far stronger than in our timeline, in every aspect, potentially rivaling the economy of the US. In Germany, though, calls for unification would get louder over the decades, and around the late 1960s, there would be extreme calls for unification in all three German states, in which the West would permit given the pre-existing limitations on Germany's military power and military resources due to EU agreements. And so, by the early 70s, West Germany, East Germany, and Austria would unite. Overall, this world would be rather odd compared to our own, with the economies of significant US rivals in our timeline like Russia and China being significantly weaker, and the economies of its allies in Europe being far stronger, which may encourage the US into a more of an isolationist mindset once again. As for nuclear capabilities, the US would likely organize several independent nuclear treaties with some of its allies, like Britain, France, and maybe even Japan or China. There would be placed significant international restrictions on the use of nuclear weaponry, and the MAD policy would be established worldwide through the UN to prevent any war from being as destructive as World War III. But that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to see more crazy videos. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!